we start? Yeah, okay. So, for those of you who were just down in the cinema, I don't know if any of you made it up the hill, as we just did, but we just watched Pleasure at Her Majesty's down in Cinema 3, which was one of over 160 documentaries that this man has made. In 50 years of filmmaking, looking around the room, I think most of us probably weren't alive when he started making films, which is fairly terrifying. And looking around the room, I suspect some of your parents weren't alive when he started making films. So it's an incredible career and an incredible body of work. And I won't say how old Roger is, but if I'm still half as energetic and productive and brilliant as he is when I'm nearer his age, I'll be very, very happy indeed. Roger's got a career of many firsts. So he was the first filmmaker to gain observational access to the UN and to the EU and to the British government and to the police and to prisons and to multinational boardrooms and to family therapy and to sex offenders units. He also invented the very first international co-production for documentary. He made the first full-length film about Islam for Western television, and together with Richard Curtis, he created the genre that is now comic relief, although, of course, we've just seen Pleasure at Her Majesty's, which in a way which preceded comic relief and was that idea of documentary and comedy coming together to raise money for charity. What drives Roger, though, is basically a desire to make the world a better place, to root out injustice, push the boundaries to access, and also explore form. I think it's amazing that a man of Roger's extraordinary breadth of career and depth of career was, in the last couple of years, making short documentaries for Google about CERN. I mean, I read that in broadcast and thought, that's so cool. Roger Graef, BAFTA fellow, multi-award-winning documentary maker of very hard-hitting, observational, gritty documentaries with no commentary and no music, is making short docs for Google about CERN. Roger's the founder of, and chair of Films of Record, excuse me, now in its 35th year of production. He's a founding member of Channel 4, and he's an author, a criminologist, an independent advisor on race for the Metropolitan Police. BAFTA made him a fellow back in 2004, and a couple of months ago we had a special tribute last month, which I have to say was extraordinary to see. I was in the second row of that tribute, and I looked back in the Princess Anne Theatre. Those of you who know BAFTA, it's a pretty big theatre. It's about a 250-seater, and you looked back. First of all, it was standing room only, and they had to set up a video feed to another room, the Runner and Shaw room at the back, where people who had arrived who hadn't been able to get in could sit and watch the Q&A and Roger's lecture. And that apparently is the first time they've done. The last time they did that was when Dustin Hoffman was in town and did a Q&A. Not only that, but I sat there on the second row and I looked back, when the lights were still up, I looked back at these rows of senior execs, of chief execs, of commissioning editors, of basically the great and the good in television, who wanted to come and hear what Roger had to say about documentary making and wanted to come and hear him interviewed on his career. So I think we want to hear from Roger more than we want to hear from me. So I'll hand over to Robyn, who is going to interview Roger and take us through a chronology of his work.
Neither of these are working. That one's working. Mine's is working. So the people in the back row are still welcome in their seats in the front because my voice is just so thin at the moment. So anyway.
So, I'm on. Oh, good. Yay! Okay, so now then, as Brian has said, obviously some incredible number of firsts. You're a pioneer in both the documentary making processes you have developed and in the impact that your films have achieved. I just want to go right back to the 60s where it all started. What led you to television?
Well, I had wanted to be a campaigning lawyer and a judge when I was at school. And going up to university, I thought I'd study law and, become Clarence Darrow. He was my hero. If you don't know who he was in the room, he was a great defender of human rights and so on in America, civil rights. And I discovered that I asked my great uncle what books on justice I should read before I went up, and before I went to study law. He said, because he taught law, and he said, we don't study justice, we study law. And the first lesson is they have nothing to do with each other. So I then ended up in the theater because I saw the way audiences were responding. And I thought that's what I would do, is create social justice, as it were. I mean, trying to explore social justice, and then the law would change. And I saw, when I was directing plays, when I came to England, I managed to get a play to direct at the Royal Court a week after I arrived. And that was just wonderful. And it transferred to the West End, and I suddenly had been, this was it, really. And then 2 years later, two things happened at the same time. One is I saw a film called One More River, which maybe Steve might remember, but it was a CBC film about the Southern Civil Rights movement and had no commentary and no music. And it was just footage of the shocking events down in Alabama and so on, but it also had an interview with two rednecks from Georgia talking about how beleaguered they felt by everybody in the rest of the country telling them how to live their lives. And I was a New York liberal of the classic kind, I campaigned, my grandfather ran for Congress, my father was a doctor helping black doctors and immigrant doctors and so on, classic liberal. I'd never, ever listened to people like that, the rednecks, unmediated, quite a long scene. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And here, with all my assumptions, I was obliged to identify with them because it was filmed so directly and so honestly. And I just thought, this is the stuff of social justice, and showing it to millions of people was a great way to do it. And I had already been at the Actors Studio, which again some of you may know, and they were looking at significant detail, the characterization of significant detail. So I just put those two things together and thought, this is what I want to do. I want to make documentaries for television. But the first film, which I think we've got a clip of, was not out of that. That was just a sense. I called the thalidomide. I had my first flop, that's right. I was seeing that film on television also coincided with my very first flop. I had directed an absurd number of plays, something like 6 plays, 2 operas and 2 television dramas by the time I was 28, and only one of them flopped, but the 26th flopped. And I was completely unprepared for that, and I was really quite thrown by the whole experience. And so I rang the Thalidomide Society, who at that point, were in the news, and their kids were 3 years old or 4 years old, and said, would you like a benefit at the Palladium? And they said, no, what we want is our kids to go to normal schools, infant schools and primary schools. And the head teachers read the papers and think they've got no brains. Actually, they have no arms, in some cases no legs and no arms, but they've got brains. Would you make a film for just, like 10 people, there's 10 head teachers of those schools? So I make this film, which we can show a clip of, and it completely changed people's understanding of what these children were like. And it went straight into the medical school curriculum. It went onto ABC television in America. This was my first little film, shown on ABC Network, CBC, BBC, all over the world. And I just thought, wow, I'm a round peg in a round hole. This is exactly all of those sort of aspirations just fitted together around this first film. And in terms of the principles, what I was doing was going behind the headlines and looking at the human face of thalidomide. What did it mean to be the parents of a thalidomide child? What did it mean to be a thalidomide child? And that was it, really.
Well, I think now's a perfect time to have a look at the first clip. I mean, it's not exactly your typical educational film of that time or of today, in fact. It is very intimate. Why did you choose the mother's voice to drive the narrative?
Well, first of all, I thought the mother was incredibly wise and very... I wanted people in... This is really a very interesting problem. In Britain particularly, but also in America, when you're talking about people who have handicap or disability or, I come from a medical family, and I know the way in which doctors treat people as cases. And the children here had been seen by all the doctors as cases, not as children. And so the scene of them playing with his brothers and kicking with his feet and all that stuff really shocked a great many people. They had never imagined that. He does the dishes with his feet, all that stuff. They hadn't thought about it because they only saw him. And I think, in doctors, in consultants talk about demonstrating a patient, right? They even do it in mental hospitals. They'll demonstrate somebody with echolalia and so on. So these children were brought in and demonstrated to the other doctors. So what I wanted to do was create exactly the opposite and say, this is a family, and I chose, a really attractive kid and a very nice, normal family, and say, this could be you, right? This is not a case. This is no distancing. You have to identify. You just have to. You can't. You'd be dead if you didn't. Although there was a Canadian guy who'd been in the Marines who fled when he came to the screening about that scene of the kicking. He just couldn't handle it, which I found unforgettable and shocking in itself. But so because people have, kind of coded handicap and the thalidomide children as victims, helpless victims, then when you suddenly see them as a normal kid, that's quite a shock. I don't know if you found that, but certainly it was true back in the 60s.
Yeah, definitely. And the Wellcome Trust screened the film for its 75th anniversary only in 2011. So
That's right.
How did the film go down, just 3 years ago?
Well, actually, both at BAFTA when we showed this clip and that screening, it went down incredibly well. People just said, this is really powerful. It's very fresh, and it's been discussed that I should go back to Australia and find Brett and do a sort of update. But he's been in touch with me off and on over the years, and he was running a record company, the sort of CD company doing sounds of the rainforest, and he did a tour of Europe playing the piano with his feet, and a very independent guy, very independent.
The film's impact must have had an effect on your filmmaking career, the power of films to bring about real change.
Absolutely.
How important is social purpose to you as a filmmaker?
It's total. I have made arts films and various other kinds of films as well, comedy films, but they all had a social purpose. Mm-hmm. And in the case of the arts films, it was to try and get people not to be too frightened of art. And again, a lot of the arts films I've made show artists, very famous artists, as human beings. And just, Pierre Boulez in it looking at his fridge at 3 a.m. saying there's nothing to eat. And Jacques Lifshitz taking a protege of his to a Jewish restaurant and, telling her about celery tonic and buying the crappiest shoes you could possibly imagine. And he was one of the greatest sculptors in the world, that kind of thing. So I just wanted them to be ordinary, so that you weren't frightened,
Yeah. So the Brett film led to a strong relationship with the BBC, and you went on to make numerous films for the arts department.
Yes.
Why are the arts such an important thread to your work?
Well, okay, this is a good question, actually, Robyn. Thank you. I was privileged to grow up in a nice middle-class family with lots of music and art and so on, and I went to a creative school, rather like Bedales in this country or Dartington. So I realized just how much art added to people's lives. But then I watched, including my own mother, the way in which it became commodified, right? It belonged to certain middle-class types of people. You went to the opera and sat there in your nice clothes and looked at each other, really, and not much at the stage. That kind of feeling that art was something, you went to museums and whispered, and and also in the contemporary art, 60s was already the start of the New York City movement and all this stuff. People were scared to have judgments. They didn't just react. They had to read the critics. They had to be told what to think and what to feel. And so what I thought was, if I could make films in which, for example, Boulez's music could be made accessible to a wider audience, then the next time they heard a piece of contemporary music, they wouldn't be scared. And actually PBS, as Steve, I don't know if it's still going on, but I know for many, many years, PBS played my Boulez film in the interval of contemporary concerts, or at least concerts that had contemporary music in it, just to say, this is what's going on in the composer's head. Don't be scared. You can understand it, right? So I'm trying to build bridges to people so they can connect with sculpture, painting, art, films, but not through the experts. And I'm just, if I may tell a very quick story, I don't know if you agree with this, but there was a famous series in the 60s called Civilization, which is about to be redone by Kenneth Clark, presenting all over the Western Europe, the giants of this stuff. And he was fantastic, but every sort of third or fourth shot, every location, he'd have a different suit on, and he had a very patrician voice, and he was a great expert. And Isaiah Berlin, who was a friend of his, was asked what he thought of it. And Berlin, who had this rather tortured half Russian, half German accent, which I will only fail to imitate, said, well, I do think Kenneth did awfully well, but he did rather give the impression that the whole thing could never have happened without him. And, that idea that the experts own the subject is what I've been trying with my films, including, by the way, the recent CERN films about particle physics, to say, particle physics is stuff you can understand. These are funny guys. They make jokes about it. They wear baseball caps. They send themselves up. There's nothing should be out of reach as long as you find the human face to it. That's why.
Okay, so this is sort of running into our next clip now. You were asked by the arts department to make a film about communication. Roger, of course, went the extra mile and decided to go get unprecedented access to the UN and the art of corridor bargaining. Can you tell us a little bit how commissioning worked back then? I'm sure it's not quite the same.
Well, thank you. It's a funny story, actually. I was asked to do this series on on the English language for a group of English language broadcasters, Canada, America, and PBS, Australia, and the BBC. And, making a film about the English language was just hard, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And I was sitting reading, and I'm serious, reading texts of psycholinguistics in the office of the arts department, because they had brought the text there. And I was just struggling, And that morning, while I was reading, the arts commissioner comes out and says, would you like to make a film about Ingmar Bergman? While I was preparing the series. And I said, sure, yeah, but he's a recluse. He's a famous recluse, never gives interviews. Why do you think? Oh, I'll call the head of Svensk film industry, it'll be all right. He can't get hold of him. So an hour later, I'm still headbanging on this psycholinguistics. And he comes in again and says, how'd you like to make a film about Graham Greene? And I said, well, that's fine. When you've picked another recluse, that's terrific, But yes, of course, if he'd agree, I'll do it, And I'm just still reading this really hard stuff. And then he came in and said, would you like to make a film about Ginger Rogers? And I said, well, yes, she's very interesting, sort of right-wing actress and rather more easily accessible, I thought. She was playing an Auntie Mame in the West End. And at lunchtime, I was told that she was a complete nightmare. And I had that day before asked them, or in fact, even the start of that day, said, could I make a film about Agadir in Morocco and Kansas City and Mexico City? And my head of department had said, nobody gives a fuck about Morocco, right? That was a famous remark at that point. And so then the arts guy, after the lunch, said, do you know Gordon Watkins, who was the head of the department, religious department? He came out and said, have you ever been to Morocco? And I said, yeah, the day before. And he said, would you like to make a film about the Quran in Fez? And I said, yes, I'd love to, thank you very much. And I just said one thing, I just think I should tell you, by the way, I'm Jewish. And he said, oh, that's all right, for the purpose of this film, we'll forget it. And so I made the first film on Islam during that point and thought about all during this period, the next 6 months, how to solve the communication problem. And then I realized all I should do is watch situations where communication happens, okay? So a family, we did a film Family and Therapy. The school, we filmed a relationship between a particular teacher and a child and the class. We filmed a work dispute where everybody thought it was going to be fine. I just wanted to see, because there were a lot of strikes in those days, and I thought that'll be interesting. And we filmed for 2 months, and on the very last day, during the edit, when we had a 2-hour edit, I rang up saying, how's it going? And they said, oh, we're about to go out on strike because there'd been a note left in an office about redundancies, which they'd been promised weren't going to happen. So I scrapped 2 hours of film and 2 months of filming and went down for 24 hours, shot both sides of the dispute, and that's a really good film on industrial relations. Then we filmed politics. Nixon was president and Mondale was running a Senate committee, and we filmed his attempt to reach Nixon. And then finally diplomacy, which is the 5th of those examples where in everyday life communication should happen. So I spent quite a long time ringing around from my little office at the BBC to try and get access. And we started with the State Department. They said, sure, you can film the border talks with Canada and Mexico. And I said, okay, right, you do realize it's got sound. Oh, no sound. You can film it, but you know sound. So that was, okay, not much good. So while we then made the other 4 films, we were trying all sorts of places. And typically the commissioning editor said, how about the Vietnam peace talks? And I said, I don't think so if we can't get it, you know. So it was all mad, really. But at the end of a year, phone rings. Then this is how my life works. Phone rings. It's the State Department here. Oh, yes, hi. Are you still interested in a film on diplomacy? Yes. Well, the Assistant Secretary of State and the ambassador, who was then George Bush, who became president, said, you can come and film their delegation to Geneva, to ECOSOC, because they think that's fine. So I said, I'm coming with sound recorders too, is that okay? Oh, yes, yes, bring your brownie, they said, okay? And so I went to Washington with my team, and the Pentagon Papers were being sued in the Supreme Court about 100 meters away from us. And we wandered around the State Department with a crew, with no lights, no staging, and the civil servants just looked completely astounded, you know. But what was going on in ECOSOC and the UN at that point was very, very interesting, and I needed access to the building in Geneva. So I rang, here's the nice bit, sorry, it's a long story, but it's actually rather nice. I went to see a man called Brian Urquhart, who was the number 2 at the UN, very posh Englishman, brilliant guy, and we went to describe this. And Ralph Bunche, who was a very famous negotiator, black American negotiator, came in looking very tired with his jacket over him and his pork pie hat on the back of his thing. And Brian turned to him and said, Rafe, these chaps here from the BBC, they want to make a film on diplomacy. What do you think of that? And Bunche, with a very thick sort of Detroit accent, says, guys, he said, diplomacy. He said, I don't know how you're going to do it, but if you ever make a film about diplomacy, I want a copy. And so he got a copy, because what then happened is I rang the head of the UN in Geneva at Brian's suggestion, a man called Winspear Gucciardi, who was about 6'6" and had an office as big as this room. And I go in there and he says, what do you want, Mr. Graef? He said, you do realize I can't give you permission to do anything but film in the building. And I said, that's all right, we're working through our country by country, we've got the US. And he said, you will have to ask every country for permission. You know, I can't give it to you. But you can film in the building. And so I said, okay, that's fine. And as I was leaving, he said, by the way, Mr. Graef, next time you want a request to film in the UN, we have a press office that might be helpful, you know. But, you know, so I just sailed through, and we turned up, and we were there with the American ambassador. And at the middle of the UN crisis at that point was about the Third World being represented on the Security Council and the Economic and Social Council, okay? So there was a group of 78. It's called UNCTAD, you probably know it. And they said, we want, 78 countries were lobbying to be part of this, okay? Now, how do you choose the story? And that was the big story. So we were filming that. But also we filmed 2 or 3 other initiatives. And one of them was about setting up a disaster relief coordinator, because the Biafran crisis and several others had been really ridiculous and people were sending all the wrong stuff. So Bush proposed that they set up a disaster relief coordinator who would have the powers to mobilize, direct, and coordinate other UN agencies. Well, if any of you know the bureaucracies you work in, they don't like being directed. They don't mind mobilizing, they don't mind coordinating, but they don't like being directed. So the Brits, whose support was being needed, called a meeting to try and get that word taken out. And we filmed for 3 weeks while the press corps was following the big story of the 78, one word, right? And the film is all about one word. And we were up and down and sideways in lifts, by swimming pools, at bedrooms at night, calling Washington and New York and so on, just about the one word. And I'm incredibly fond of this film because it's so pure. So the scene you're about to see is a meeting between the Americans and the Brits. And the ambassador to ECOSOC took over from Bush and was trying to get this initiative accepted intact with the word direct included. And he took on all the big agencies, WHO, Red Cross, and so on, as you will hear. So this is corridor work, as you will see.
In the documentaries, yeah, we had that one. It is good. And as you were saying before, actually, persistence is the art of access getting.
It is.
You know, you have you sort of have to be honest with your contributors. I mean, was it easier then to get access than it is now?
Yes, oh, infinitely easier.
Yeah.
I mean, people are very savvy now, and they try and manipulate you. And so what I try and do is find people in big organizations who I can trust and who trust me. And they then pass that trust on. And frankly, it doesn't always reach everybody. And there will be people in every situation who are very jumpy or have a default suspicion of the media. And that's hard. It's pushing a boulder up a hill. I mean, we did 3 films in Coventry Children's Services, and I can't remember if we've got a clip. I think we do, don't we, Alice? In there. 3 separate films. And each one, you know, went down incredibly well with Coventry's Children's Services. But we had to start from scratch each time, as if we hadn't done them once before. We couldn't just say, you've seen what we do with kids in care, you've seen what we did with child protectors. Each one, and a whole group of social workers were never, ever persuaded to work with us. And Brian knows that from his own experience. You know, there is a lot of paranoia now. And, you know, I want to say something about that, which I think is a bit controversial because not everybody in the room will agree with this. But I think the films that have been accused of manipulating people haven't necessarily always done that, but that the people in the films have either played to the camera themselves or are larger than life. And when we get to the rape film, the guy in that who was absolutely pilloried up and down the country, and we were credited with having chosen this kind of show-off and character. We avoided him like the plague. He walked into the room while we were filming. And sometimes these things where the people assume that we are diabolical and twisting and, you know, destroying material are just watching. And I personally liked some of the characters in Benefit Street very much. And there was the shots and sequence was long enough, so I didn't feel they were being cut unfairly. Now, there's a lot of controversy around that, and my colleagues in the company I work with, they don't agree with me at all. But as long as people have enough space to talk for themselves, I think that's a sign of trust. And you absolutely, I mean, we always show the films, access films to the people in them. We correct factual accuracy and confidentiality. And I've never lost anything that I thought was unreasonably asked for. You know, it's a collaboration, and so yeah, that's you have to find people you can trust and who will trust you, and it's harder, definitely harder.
Well, diplomacy set the precedent, obviously, for access, for a whole string of access. I mean, you went on to make the first documentary inside the British government and the EU.
That's right.
And then, of course, it was probably only a matter of time before you managed to get your way into the police force, which is, of course, we were talking about the gentleman earlier. So now I'd like to show a clip from your best-known film from the Police series, A Complaint of Rape, which you co-produced and directed with Charles Stewart in 1992.
Indeed. Now, just before we show it, this wasn't the first access to the police, but it was certainly the longest and deepest and most informal. That's what it was. There had been a series on the BBC. You know, there have been cop shows before. But what we did was stand back or, you know, follow them and watch. And we didn't prejudge what was interesting, but we did prejudge what was relevant simply because what was the agenda. And the treatment of alleged rape victims by the police was very controversial at that point. The women's groups were complaining terribly, bitterly about it, and the cops said, it doesn't happen, right? They just simply denied it. They said occasionally, so maybe, but it's not our policy. And I had watched them train young women officers to disbelieve victims. And they were saying 60% of rape victims make it up. Oh, really? Where'd they get that number from? So I knew it was policy, and we had tried 5 times in the course of 9 months over a year, 5 cases, and we couldn't get it. And this was the 6th, and it was the week before we finished filming. And we were told that a girl had walked in and said she'd been raped by 3 men, and she was being interviewed, and did we want to film? And she didn't want to be shown on camera. So we filmed from behind her head, and I'll talk to you afterwards about why that's so important, but you will see that it means that the cops are looking right at you, because the camera's looking right at them from behind her head. And that, coupled with all the publicity that was going on, was the elements of an incendiary film.
I mean, 11 million people watched that documentary, well, that series, and no special effects, no music, and from beginning to end, it's pretty gripping. I've seen the whole episode myself, and even now, just watching that small clip, it still ignites a big emotion. So you were telling us there's a reason behind not showing the woman's face.
Well, she just didn't want to be shown. And at a certain point, the police said, you don't want these guys here, do you? And so we left the room. She said, no. We left the room. And then when they left again, I went back in and said, are you sure you don't want us there? Because, you know, as rude as they're being to you, it may be that we can protect you. Mm-hmm. And she said, yes, please come back in. And I was in the next room because I didn't want to outnumber the cops. So right. We had the sound man, who you saw, and the cameraman. But what really was interesting at the end of all that was that she had been in a mental hospital and she was slightly subnormal, and they knew that. And they just said, you know, it'll never fly as a case, and that was that. And at the very end, one of the other detectives, when they go out of the room, they just said, well, you know, she decides not to press the case and leaves. And one of the other detectives said she made a complaint earlier in the year, and these guys say, oh, yeah, she's always complaining. And the other detective said, yeah, but it was never proved that she was wrong. And that's the last line of the film, okay? This film goes out, and it is so powerful that it makes CBS News. It's shown on Swedish television news. It was front page news. Thatcher talked about it in Parliament. It really did rock the country in that sense. And it changed the way the police handle rape victims. But they didn't admit it for 5 years. They blamed the Scottish bloke as being a bit of a fool, and he was the one we tried to avoid, by the way, because he's like that. He's like that in the pub. He's like that all the time. And I knew that we would be blamed for his style. But it did change the way the police handle rape. And the Policy Studies Institute they said this was the most influential film in terms of changing public policy that had ever been shown on British television. And Cathy Come Home changed an understanding about homelessness, and that wasn't a documentary anyway. But this actually changed police practice.
I mean, obviously, before it aired, did you show the police the clip?
Oh, we showed them all.
What did they make of it?
They just said, oh, yes, of course, she would be a hopeless witness.
I mean, and was it, did you do it on purpose? We saw your sound man at the end there. You know, she was sort of left in the room with him alone. And
no, I didn't do it. I wasn't even in the room. They all leave. She starts talking to him. And the cameraman's decision, my co-producer, he made the right decision to say, look, you can't just be talking to the wall. Yeah. That would really look crazy. So he panned to see Malcolm, who, you know, I thought that was, I chose that clip out of a whole very tough series of moments, because I wanted you to see the cameraman and see just how discreet we are and were as a presence.
I mean, obviously, we've talked about the impact the film had. Obviously, it changed the way rape cases were handled. Would you say it was fair to say this film marks a defining moment in your career in terms of your understanding of the power of documentary to achieve real change? That's,
again, a good question. Yes, it did. I mean, what happened was that, you know, this whole series was 2 places behind Dallas. It was we averaged 10 million, and 11 million was the highest. 12 watched that. And it was on the front pages. It was news. Every week, people would ring me up and say, now, what scandal are you going to... And I kept saying, these aren't scandals. This is the police going about their business. But that you haven't seen before because you've only had the fictional version. So then the bill was modeled on this series. Because the really interesting thing about the whole series is there's almost no crime. When there is a bit of crime, they kind of do or don't catch somebody. You know, I mean, it's so different from the fictional version. You know, and it's full of insights. So you watch it with, you know, like 10 or 11 million people did. BBC One, 10 o'clock, no music, no commentary. And people just went into this world which they thought they knew, just like the thalidomide film, right? They thought they knew it, but they didn't, and this was the revelation.
So in 1982, it was the year that the series won a BAFTA. It was also the year in which Channel 4 launched. What impact did the arrival of Channel 4 have on the documentary industry?
Well, we had been trying for years to get people who weren't just in-house to make films, and I was lucky enough to be the first freelance to make films outside of the in-house teams. Mm-hmm. And Alan King Associates, we did all the arts films and so on the same way. But I think it's fair to say that it opened up a market which up to that point simply wasn't there. ITV had its own in-house teams, BBC had its own in-house teams, and suddenly there was a place you could sell films and would take risks which the BBC and ITV would not take. So the early years, if any of you are interested, I would commend to you, just look up, either online or wherever, Dorothy Thingamy's book and so on, about the first 10 years of Channel 4, because we took incredible risks. And it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. Didn't get big audiences necessarily, by any means. But, you know, I mean, Derek Jarman did a film in Latin, a gay film, Sebastian it's called, in Latin, right? Nick Hart-Williams did one in Celtic. You know, I mean, we had a Brazilian soap opera called Mala Mujer for an entire year, which I thought was terrific, and Brazilian soap operas are terrific. And this was all subtitled. So, you know, we were taking risks of that kind that nobody else was. And I think it added spice, if you like, to a fairly conventional landscape, and continues to do so at its best.
Amazing. So after the police series, you went on to make films about the crime squad cracking down on gangs and so forth. And the American version of In Search of Law and Order was actually influenced the Youth Justice Board here in the UK.
It did.
Why was the criminal justice system of such interest to you?
Well, I had done all these police films. I mean, by the time I wrote a book about the police as well. I interviewed 600 coppers with the help of several people, Harry Lansdowne among them. And we published a book called Talking Blues, which at that point, again, was the first time cops were talking honestly about racism, domestic violence, corruption, all of those things. And so I was expert on the police. And the Sunday paper rang up at the time of the Strangeways. Those of you who aren't British, there was Strangeways prisoners, a big prison in Manchester, and had riots with the prisoners up on the roof for about 40 days. Well, it was a very long time, a couple of weeks at least. And they just rang up and said, would you ask judges why they send people to prison? Right? Very simple question. I thought I knew the answer. And I didn't. I interviewed 14 judges and magistrates and so on. They all said the same thing. Do you want to guess what it was? What did they say? They all said the same thing. Different ages, races, politics.
I wouldn't even know how to answer.
No, they said, we don't know what else to do. They said a small number of people deserve to be in prison, but they just didn't know what else to do. And I just was so shocked by that answer. I said, well, I'll find you something else to do. And so I've spent, really, that's how I became a criminologist. I went all over the world looking for positive ways to deal with particularly young offenders without sending them to prison. And I wrote a book on restorative justice, which I'm very interested in. I wrote another book following young offenders for 18 months and got to know what drove them. So the two series, In Search of Law and Order, UK and US, were based on my efforts to find positive ways to deal with crime and criminals that weren't prison. And the first three went down very well: sentencing, crime, community policing, sentencing, and punishment is the third one. And then I decided to do it in America as well, with PBS again. And Channel 4 took that. Actually, they took both of them. I'm being stupid. But the interesting thing is bringing back the rushes from these very interesting experiments in Texas, San Francisco, and Boston. And I purposely didn't go to Chicago, LA, and New York. Right? I wanted to be normal crime, normal kids doing tough things. The Home Secretary asked me to give a speech with my rushes to all the ministers of the relevant departments, which I was thrilled to do. So the Solicitor General asked me to do the same thing, the Director of Public Prosecutions. I was still just showing rushes. And then when it was finished, we had a joint conference, Channel 4 and the Home Office, and they brought all the key characters in my series, not the criminals, I have to say, but the probation officers and so on. They brought them over for 3 or 4 days to teach probation service and the Young Youth Justice Board imaginative ways to deal with this stuff. So, you know, I felt very pleased about that, to be honest. And that, by the way, a few years later, I woke up one morning and thought, hey, when I was young and I wanted to change things through social justice, that's what I'm doing. But I'd sort of forgotten that original intention. It's very nice, you know.
It's great. So now we're actually going to move on to the clip from The Siege of Scotland Yard, which you directed and produced.
I did, yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about
Yes,
the clip?
The Siege of Scotland Yard is very interesting. And this was, I mean, it sounds, I hope it doesn't sound arrogant, but we build the trust and we kept the faith with everybody that we ever filmed. So when the Macpherson inquiry, which for, again, the non-Brits, it was an inquiry into the racism in the police after the killing of Stephen Lawrence. When that was happening, the commissioner of the Met called me in and said, look, what are we going to do about this? Because we really care about racism and we're tackling it, but no one will believe us. They'll believe you. So we'll give you the run of the Met for a year about race. You can do whatever you want for a year. So we made this film called Race Against Crime. And then the week of the report coming out, I realized that the commissioner himself was in serious danger of being fired, right? He was just... That's all the press was saying, you know, if the report is negative and the Home Secretary calls for his head, even though it wasn't his fault and he wasn't racist, he'd have to go. So I said to Channel 4 and to the commissioner, look, our other film is being made, it's fine, it's really good, it's fair to everybody, blah, blah, blah. But nobody will know what you're going through in the week of hell up to the report and how anxious you are and how serious you are about it and all of that. So I will follow you for a week and make a second film just about this week of hell. And if you get sacked and you don't want us to show it, that's okay. But on the other hand, if you do get sacked, this will be an honest account. Rather than you getting blamed for everything, you will have your version on film. And Channel 4 said yes. So they gave us enough money to shoot for a week this second film. And the clip you're about to see, I mean, the access was wonderful. I was on his floor the whole time and filming all his meetings. But I went with him in his Land Rover to a place in South London with big police headquarters with something like 400, 300 officers, all his top brass. And there was a screen bigger than that, so that size, on which the Home Secretary's announcement to Parliament was being broadcast live, okay? And as you will see, I am sitting literally at his knees. He's very tall anyway. And I wanted the shot of his face watching. So I watched with him and 300 officers, him learning his fate. And the only other person in the clip is the number 3 in the Met, who also was supporting what we were doing and is the star of the other film. It's called Dennis O'Connor. And he's busy trying to arrange the report and so on to make sure that the commissioner, if he hasn't, well, even if he does have to quit, you know, has the report, because none of them have read the report. So this is a moment of total uncertainty with the biggest institution in Britain and the head of it trusting me to watch him endure this.
Wow. So race and justice has been a major theme in the work, and obviously this was the year you were appointed as an advisor for race for the Metropolitan Police. How did it come about? Was it due to the film, or?
Yes, it was. But I've made, I think, more films about race than anybody else I know. I've made 8 films about race and also about race in the police. So, and I've been very critical of the Met. So they actually gathered together an advisory group based on their critics, to their credit, and we've been advising them for 14 years.
Wow. Since directing September Morning, I'm sort of going ahead a bit now, about 9/11 in 2002, you've been exclusively executive producing groundbreaking films for all the major TV channels, from The Protectors, Murder Blues, Searching for Madeleine. Has this been a difficult transition for you?
Well, I ran a small company which made one film at a time when I was directing, and my very sweet board said, this is nonsense because you'll never be able to make enough films to get the company to work. So, as Brian, I think, discovered as well, if you can let other people make films for you that you've set up and you've gained the access to, then you can keep doing that while other people make the films, as long as they keep the faith. And I was lucky enough to have directors who did just that. And so I'm really proud of the output of Films of Record since 2002, when I stopped. because I found so many brilliant people, Kim Longinotto, Julian Temple, Simon Gilchrist, various other people who, Ricardo Pollack, they've all produced work that's probably better than I would have done if I'd been directing it, to be honest.
So the penultimate clip is from the second episode of a programme about malaria, the vaccine challenge, directed by Kevin Hull in 2004. Do you want to give the context of the clip?
Yes, this was very interesting, actually. Again, I'm very interested in science. I love science, but I don't love it as an expert. I love it as somebody who just consumes, interesting information about the world and how we live in our bodies. And I was sitting at a dinner party next to a woman called Janice Taverne, who was Dick Taverne, the MP's wife. And I said to her, what do you do? And she said, I'm the editor of a website called Parasitology Today. And I thought, this is going to be quite a long evening. I said, are there any stories that I should know about as a filmmaker, journalist, And she said, well, yes, there is. She said, there's a race to produce a vaccine for malaria between Oxford, the Wellcome Trust there, the Navy, US Navy, and the US Army, all are racing to do this, okay? And I said, fantastic, the race for Stockholm, it'll be the Nobel Prize, the best thing. I sold it to the BBC immediately. I rang up all three, and they said, yes, of course you can film them. And they had, the malaria world had a whole series since the 70s of breakthroughs. They'd be a big press conference, they'd say, we've cracked it, we've got a vaccine, and then it didn't work, okay? So they assumed that's what we would do, is just film their next excitement and disappear. Well, we stayed with them for 3 years, and PBS, we were making it for PBS and the BBC. And they just, it was up and down and sideways and up and down and sideways and so on. And we made a film inside of a Kenyan village that was struggling with malaria, and the BBC showed that as a separate film. So what this is a clip from is the film called Search for a Vaccine, Fever Road, Search for a Vaccine, where we've been following for 3 years the team trying to crack the vaccine problem. And I won't bother you with the science. It's very, very interesting how hard it is to get a vaccine against very smart. The Anopheles mosquito and the malaria virus really, it changes all the time, and it's really hard. But they thought they'd done it, and they got to the point where, as those of you know about level 2, stage 2 trials and so on, they'd got approval to go test it on humans after they did a number in Oxford that 3 out of 5 were protected for a couple of weeks, and that was enough to go to the Gambia, and we filmed the Gambia test of 200 people. And this is the results. We went back to the Gambia with them when they were processing the results on a computer, because I had to see how everybody had done. And again, this is like that last moment. Nobody in the room knows what's going to happen. Nobody. And this is the result for them of 5 years' work, as one of them says in the room. And it's midnight in the Gambia, and they're processing the data.
Well, so obviously once those results came in, was there ever a question of whether the film would go ahead and be aired?
Yes, so they had left us not left us, they let us film the ups and downs. And at the end, the final scene is Professor Hill in his, back in Oxford, having taken his proposal to a French drug company to fund the next stage of research. And there's a wonderful scene in that where the representatives of the company say, but Professor Hill, your experiment has failed. We'd love to help you, but it's got to have more hope than this, right? And it's also wistful. Anyway, he stands on his terrace, it's 10 o'clock at night, and he just looks up at the moon and he says, back to the drawing board, right? And so then we showed it, of course, to everybody. And the whole Wellcome team said, and the Imperial College team as well, who were there, said, this is the best film about science we've ever seen, because it's about failure. And so much of science is about failure, but nobody knows that, because they bury it. They don't want the sponsors to know. They don't want the drug companies to know. And so they really liked it.
Well, so you have made a number of science films, and actually we're going to move on to the final clip. We're sort of running a little bit behind schedule.
Oh, okay,
but it's okay. People want to ask you questions, and I don't want to eat into that time. Okay. So it's dominated your work in more recent years, and of course that subject is children. And now we actually have a clip from The Truth About Adoption, which I think really speaks for itself. So.
Okay. It's a panorama special, that's all.
Really, really moving clip, and obviously we saw the little boy Connor at the end there. Do you know how the story panned out?
Well, yes,
afterwards?
he stays with them, but not as adopted.
Right.
They're long-term fostering.
Right.
So he's still got his mummy and daddy, but it's not formal.
I mean, and in a case like that, do you ever worry about the birth parents viewing the film?
Oh, we showed it to her.
Yeah.
She
What did they
filmed it.
make of it?
No, well, she thought we were very fair. And
Oh,
so I
good.
said, no. Yeah.
Oh, that's
well, that's
good.
absolutely essential if you're making this kind of film.
Yeah. I mean, at any point when you're making a movie like this, did it seem like, you know, or you were worried about any of the families withdrawing at any
Oh,
point?
sure, they can, and sometimes do. Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is high-wire stuff, actually, because they're all vulnerable, they're all in crisis, and they're all very often either angry or certainly worried, or all three. Or,
Wow. I mean, so with so many awards under your belt, what motivates you now?
oh, I don't do it for the awards. I mean, this is jolly nice, but I do it to change things.
Yeah.
That speeded up the adoption process. Cameron saw it on air and made an announcement like 2 days later. And if you look at the Twitter feed, there, and indeed the same for Brian, film 15,000 Kids and Counting, there's all these people saying, I want to adopt these children, I want to adopt them, I want to become a social worker, here's something nice. The websites crashed, the adoption websites all crashed that night, all of them. And I think they did for you too. So, you know, these are people waiting to be told things that they don't otherwise know, about things they think they know about. And so when they get it in this form that's obviously authentic, they respond. So that's what keeps me going.
That is an incredible achievement as well. I mean, I can't imagine the feeling of knowing some work that you've done has done that. What do you feel the future holds for documentaries? You know, what are the greatest challenges for us all here?
Well, I think the greatest challenge is suspicion, is default suspicion that people are so media savvy that they are double-guessing our motives. And I think people like Brian and others in the room, and Debs, and people who've made Cooge, people who are making films that are straight and respect the people that we film, we need to stick together and to share our experiences and use each other as references and support, which is why I published my manifesto on the website here. I think trust is the currency. Trust with the contributors, trust with the filmmakers, the editor, the commissioning editor, series producer, the controller, and the publicists and the people making trails. All of them have to honor the promises we make, all of them. Because if they don't, somebody sees a trail that betrays what you said, or they haven't seen the film yet, or whatever, you know, then that feeds a whole chain of suspicion and starts to unravel the trust. And it's a high-wire act. It's not easy.
Any more advice for any budding young Roger Graefs that are probably watching
They should
you
read
today?
my manifesto on the website or on the BAFTA Guru, because that's my advice. Don't play safe. That's my advice.
It's a good one. Because, of course, it is about risk, and, you know, it's about challenging people. And it has been a great honour to be talking with you today. It really has. As you celebrate your 50th anniversary in documentary filmmaking, do we have time to show Her Majesty's service?
No, Her Pleasure, Her Majesty.
Pleasure, Her
Quite a lot of
Majesty.
people just came to it. Let's do that
Yeah?
at the very end. Let's get some questions.
Well, then now it's time for questions, so please don't hold back. Anybody want to ask Roger anything? We have a mic. Oh, down in the front, please.
And there's somebody in the back too, I think,
Sure.
and somebody there.
Hi, Roger. That was a lovely presentation and really insightful. One question I have is how these days, during your career, what initiates an inquiry for you? Is it from yourself? Is it in response to something in the news, or does it actually sometimes come particularly? Does it come from a particular community? You know, the
No, it's just
themselves.
what I do is I follow my own curiosity. So if I meet like that story about malaria, it was, you know, at a dinner party. I wasn't thinking about malaria, but when I heard 3 people are racing to solve the biggest medical problem in the world at that point, where a jumbo jet was, you know, crashing with children every 3 minutes, you know, that's brilliant. So that was how I found that story. And Kim Longinotto, who's just walked in, you know, she made this wonderful film with us, Hold Me Tight, Let Me Go. But I'd known about the school, the Mulberry Bush School, for years. And then it was a question of finding the right person in the right moment to get the access and turn that into a film, which Kim did brilliantly. But, I mean, they'd asked me to be a patron of the school, so I knew about it. But I wasn't sure how to do it or really focus on it until Kim was kind enough to do it. So I find it anywhere. I listen to the news a lot, and I just think, what's behind the news? That's what I do.
Anyone else?
Hi, thank you for that. Such a broad spectrum of incredibly interesting films. I was wondering, is there one that got away? Is there one film that you just never got around to making that you'd still love to do?
Well, it's not that it got away because of that. I was making it, but we never quite got the access right. We had access to the Attorney General's office, and he is the advisor, the government's lawyer. And the access we were given was limited because of the politics. They just said we couldn't do the political stuff. So we were doing porn, for example, which is very, very interesting. 2 cases of exactly the same magazine, acquitted in one city and convicted in another. So there was stuff that was good, but it wasn't the real story. And I sort of always, that niggles me, sadly. I'd like to do the Attorney General's office sometime.
Anyone else?
I just have one question. When you said you showed the footage to the family or the mother,
Yes.
at what stage do you decide you're going to show it to someone?
Always.
So
Oh, we show it when it's edited.
oh, is it?
No, we don't show it unedited. No, we say, this is what we propose to show on television.
And then when would you make changes? Or
Oh, yes, yes. But we do the changes. The consent forms we give people and the promises we make are very clear. Accuracy and confidentiality. We will absolutely legally change anything that is either inaccurate or confidential. And then we say fairness is something we take very seriously, but the editorial control rests with the broadcaster. So if somebody says you got the balance wrong, I'll tell you a quick story about that, which is rather nice. I made a film, the first film inside British government was with Geoffrey Howe, who was a minister. And we showed it to him, and he said, very good film, Roger, but there's not enough on paper. We do a lot of our work on paper. And I said, Geoffrey, this is ITV primetime television. How do you show that? And he said, well, if you want a picture of how the civil service works for ministers, find it. And we found a clip of a very low-level civil servant dictating a memo to the minister to resist a Labour amendment. Okay? So it was a piece of paper, but a verbally expressed one. And we put it in the film. And 3 critics picked it up and said, that's how government works, is when minor civil servants can tell ministers what to do. You know, it was a help to us. And most of the time, I made a film in a school for really disturbed children. Very disturbed, the most disturbed children in Britain, not the one that Kim made earlier. It's one for 3 to 5-year-olds kicked out of infant school, okay? And they were very disruptive, and that's what we showed. And we showed it to the teachers and the parents. And the parents said, oh yeah, our kids are like that, they're a nightmare. But the teacher said, no, every afternoon they lie down for half an hour. They have a quiet time, and it's missing. So we thought, ITV, prime time, and I put it in. And it made the film much better, because it wasn't just a whole bunch of screaming kids. It had this rhythm, different rhythm, and it changed. And it was impressive. And that also led to lots and lots of local authorities taking. This was the one place that I could find in the whole country that worked with both mothers or parents and children, and without drugs. And these were 3 to 5-year-olds kicked out of infant school, right? Interesting.
Yeah, Carrie. Gentleman in the grey shirt.
Yeah, Roger, hello.
Yes, hi,
Christian, I just want to say that was a fantastically insightful interview, really excellent questions, and you are such an inspiration to so many of us here that I'm really pleased that we put on this session, or the DocFest rather put on this session.
Thank you.
Because I'm not sure, maybe I missed it at the beginning, but you are also chair of DocFest, or you have been chair of DocFest.
No, never.
Or you've been very
No,
involved.
I'm an advisor, and I've come for
Advisor,
19 years.
But you've been so involved in the festival that I
Yes,
think
yeah.
we all owe you a big debt of thanks. But I just wanted to ask about access, because you've talked about that almost with almost every film you've made. You've said, we got the access, or it was very difficult to get the access. Do you think that's a skill? It's a very particular skill. Is it a skill that many filmmakers actually have? And how do you teach it? how can you become good at getting access? Because that seems to be the secret behind at least getting these films started.
Okay, well, first of all, we are in the presence of people like Kim and Brian who absolutely do the same. And so it's not like I've got something magic in a bottle somewhere in a cupboard that I drink when going into it. It's to do with playing straight. You know, and all you have to do is say to people, you may be under pressure and you may internalize that pressure to think you've got to hustle people. But if you just say, people don't understand what you do, we would like to show them what you do in a complex, layered, more accurate form than you've had up to now. And you'll get to see it to verify its accuracy and its fairness. Well, you know, what's not to like? I mean, somebody once said to me, you know, the best manipulation is no manipulation at all. And so I've been given this kind of credit for being a great, you know, hustler, as it were. I don't. I just go and say, I'm really interested in this. I know nothing about it. How about it? And then, you know, CERN, Wellcome Institute, all these places have just said, okay. But when we kept going back to the malaria thing, they kept saying, are you guys still here? You know, they couldn't believe we were still with them for 3 years. Because they said nobody's ever stayed for more than a week or two. So you build trust that way, you know. It's just to do with playing straight. And here's one little, you asked about a message for people in the room. Don't ask anybody to do something you wouldn't do yourself. That's a good test.
Any more questions? Yes, yes. So we'll go to the lady at the back there first, and then we'll come to you, don't worry.
Roger, thank you very much. It's been great to see the work, and thanks to the other people as well. Thank you. It's a great session. I have a rather general question to ask you. It seems to me that your films have generally great explanatory power, explanatory force. That is to say, they draw upon human reason to look at evidence and deduce what might be the case. And that's a very liberating process, if people can do that. I was just at a session showing a film from Hungary. It was the detailed coverage of a court case where some members of a Roma family, father and child and more, I think perhaps, had been killed, murdered by members of a right-wing group, clearly racist, and I believe they were found guilty at the end of the court case. After the film was shown, the filmmakers were at the front, and one of them asked about the situation in Hungary now, which is clearly very worrying.
Very bad, yeah.
Said, well, of course, the problem that we've got is, first we had communism, and now we've got democracy, and we know it's not working. Now, the problem for me is that democracy is also not working in this country, actually. And it seems to me that the two reasons for that are that A, people don't feel they know what's going on behind closed doors, and your space between words is a rather good example of how you might understand what goes on behind closed doors, or because they feel they have absolutely no input into the political process.
Absolutely.
Now, I suppose, I mean, I'm sorry to ask you to make such a generalisation.
That's right.
In my opinion, the sense that I'm getting from British broadcasters and commissioning editors today is that they're not really alert to the problem of democracy as a political system, which is very, very young and new, fledgling. You know, my mother was born before women could vote. It's a fledgling system.
Yes, I agree.
There's so much
But Sylvia, can I just...
discontent.
There are two different levels in this. The current affairs agenda does include, you know, the corruption of local authority, ministerial game playing, you know, all that stuff. You can see it in Panorama and Dispatches sometimes. But to get closer to it, you have to have the cooperation. And the Blair government were the ones who really shut it down. I've had much more access with Tory governments than I have with Labour, as it happens, although the Attorney General who let us in was Labour. So they just are now trying to control everything. You know, this business being on message and all that stuff. So the governments are not inclined to cooperate. That's one thing. But the second thing is that because of what you've described, a feeling of disempowerment, that people are rather cynical about the whole process. And, you know, I suspect Scotland's going to vote yes, possibly, just to put two fingers up to Britain, to England. I think that's just my opinion, that there's a kind of people voting against rather than voting for. They don't feel they've got the capacity and the opportunity to vote for. And I hope the films we make together, inspire people to become involved, if it's just through adopting a child, through challenging the adoption system, through, you know, giving an ex-offender a job, going to a restorative justice meeting instead of asking for tougher sentences, and just reading between the lines of the headlines rather than, and getting other sources of information than just a usual regurgitating the usual loop of disinformation. So the first thing they have to have is access to reliable information. And unfortunately, the noise in the system from all the websites and everything else coming there makes what I call documentaries, or islands of evidence in a sea of noise. So I'm hoping all the films here are good examples of that, where the people, need to trust what they see because they can't trust anything else.
Did you want to ask something still yet? Do you want the mic?
Obviously, your career spanned the US in the early
Yes.
years and the UK. Is the fact that you stayed in the UK a kind of statement on the documentary making here? Or
Yes,
just
it is
by
absolutely.
chance?
No. I mean, apart from the fact that I love it here, every time I try to go back in America, every time I do a co-production in America, the people, my colleague Fred Wiseman over there, who was not dissimilar in some ways, although he makes his own wonderful films, he just said, don't even think about coming back. You are lucky, you've got patrons here, you've got support here, you can take risks here, and I don't have to get all my cousins and aunts and uncles and friends to give me, small contributions so I can make the film. I mean, it's agony there, agony, and it's shocking. I mean, one of the great cultures, here's a little wider statement. Seems to me, what I was saying about islands of evidence are like books, right? Or paintings, or concerts, or anything else. These are works of thought, care, and observation. They're precious, and they're not treated that way. And in America, which is such a rich country in other ways, I think they have contempt for, at least on television, for the value of these things as gems of insight and gems of changing people. There's Frontline and there's a few other, what's it called, something Lens, Independent Lens. There are a couple of programs, and they're on PBS. And the rest is Fox News and all, and they're just, I think it's a tragedy. And here's my point. I don't think a more aware country would have allowed the same kind of political nonsense that Bush got away with. When Sylvia said, democracy doesn't work here, the film that was shown earlier this week called We Are Many showed the collapse of democracy in Britain, right? It showed it absolutely. Blair just ignored democracy, and he lost my support at that moment, and a lot of others. So that at least was visible, and we could have the debate. In America, just now with the NSA publications on, people are realizing what Bush had actually done, just like that, It's a tragedy, but it's a tragedy for everybody.
Are there any more questions for Roger? Yeah?
Roger, is it working? Yeah.
Roger,
Hi, Jeff.
Hi. Just to take it back to your career, there are always those moments, I think, whenever you make a film, you're always absolutely terrified every time you start. That never goes away, by the way. But there are those moments where you actually you sit in the bar afterwards with your team, you go, wow, we really pulled that off. That was a moment I won't forget. It's the moment that you'll talk about at the Christmas party. Do you have one of those moments you can tell us that? Enlighten us with a moment where you did something that you really didn't think you'd pull it off, but you did.
What a question.
Well, I'm going to tell this story slightly against myself, okay? Because we made a film inside the boardroom of British Steel, and we were in there for a couple of months, and we filmed a debate about the decision whether or not to buy 2 factories when they only needed 1.5, and so on, all this. And the end scene, when the decision was taken, was so good that we played it back to ourselves and said, wow, that's it. There's a kind of irony. I mean, the end of the diplomacy film we filmed is just very similar. They all stand around outside having the French ambassador comes, who doesn't speak as good English as his senior ambassador. So they agreed to diriger in French instead of, no, to orienter in French instead of diriger, and English stays direct, okay? But then they all come out, and the head of FAO speaks to the head of WHO and the head of Red Cross, and they all say, of course, the words don't matter, it's the person doing the job, right? So it's like a shaggy dog story for the whole film. So we had that with British Steel. We played it back saying, that's so marvelous, so witty, so splendid. And the sound recorders forgot to wind it back again. So we recorded over the best moment of the film.
Did you want to ask? Yeah, of course. Can we have another question in front?
Roger, yeah, I was very impressed with the access to the UN and to the police. I don't know whether I'm correct in saying this, but my feeling, because I haven't done a survey on this or anything, but my feeling is that kind of access doesn't happen so much anymore. Was it that people hadn't wised up to or is it am I mistaken? But
no, yes, you are mistaken. We right now we're filming with Avon and Somerset Police a live murder investigation with their elite murder squad. We've been filming for 3 months, and we've got the same kind of access. But that's because the chief constable knows me and knows my work and said, you can trust him. And we built the trust. Neil Grant is executive producer. He goes down there a lot. And so the trust is reinforced all the time.
And institutions like the UN?
That's different. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I think it's-
Well, Mr. Roger Graef, thank you very much.
You know, in Stalinist Russia, nobody could ever stop clapping. Because they were the first to get, if they stopped clapping, they'd be the first to go, you know. Thank you for that. I'm very touched.